Sarah Martinez had been carrying lunch trays through the hospital corridors for 3 years, but she had never gotten used to the weight of other people's stories. Every patient she served had a tale that followed them like a shadow, and Sarah had learned to read the unspoken words in their eyes. Some held fear, others hope, and a few carried the quiet acceptance that comes with knowing your time is limited. The morning of March 15th started like any other Tuesday at St. Mary's Medical Center. Sarah arrived at 5:30 a.m., punching her time card with the same mechanical precision she had developed over countless early mornings. The kitchen staff was already bustling around, preparing hundreds of meals for patients, visitors, and the medical staff who would spend their day fighting battles against illness and injury. "Morning, Sarah," called out Miguel, the head chef, as he arranged fresh fruit on the serving trays. "We've got a full house today." Emergency room was busy all night. Sarah nodded, tying her hair back and washing her hands thoroughly. She had learned that small details mattered in a hospital. Clean hands, a warm smile, and the ability to move quietly through hallways where people were healing or saying goodbye to loved ones. These things made her more than just someone who delivered food. She was often the only friendly face some patients would see all day. The first round of breakfast trays was always the heaviest. Not because of the weight of the food, but because morning was when reality hit hardest for many patients. The night had ended, medication had worn off slightly, and the stark hospital lighting reminded everyone exactly where they were and why they were there. Sarah loaded her cart with precision. Room 204 needed a soft diet for an elderly man recovering from throat surgery. Room 206 required a special diabetic meal for a young mother who had been admitted during her pregnancy. Room 210 had requested extra portions because the patient's teenage son had been sleeping in the chair beside his father's bed for 3 days straight. As she pushed her cart down the corridor, Sarah noticed Dr. Patricia Williams emerging from room 208. Dr. Williams was one of the younger physicians on staff, but she had quickly earned respect for her dedication to her patients. Sarah had observed her many times, staying late into the evening, holding the hand of a frightened patient or explaining medical procedures in simple terms that families could understand. "How's Mrs. Chin doing?" Sarah asked quietly as she approached with the breakfast tray. Dr. Williams paused, her expression showing the careful balance medical professionals maintained between hope and realism. "She's responding well to treatment. Her family arrives from California today." Sarah understood. In hospital language, when family traveled long distances quickly, it usually meant time was precious. She made a mental note to pay extra attention to room 208 throughout the day, perhaps offering an additional cup of tea or simply spending a few extra minutes arranging the flowers that would inevitably arrive. The pediatric wing was Sarah's favorite stop, despite the heartbreak it sometimes contained. Children had a way of finding joy even in the sterile environment of a hospital. They would eagerly await her arrival, not just for the food, but for the brief entertainment she provided. Sarah had learned to make faces that would elicit giggles, to balance crackers in impossible ways, and to remember which child preferred their sandwich cut diagonally versus straight across. 8-year-old Tommy in room 315 was recovering from appendix surgery. He had been asking everyone who entered his room about the lady with the food cart and whether she would bring him chocolate pudding again. When Sarah appeared in his doorway, his face lit up with the kind of pure happiness that reminded her why she loved her job. "Did you bring my pudding?" Tommy asked, trying to sit up straighter in his hospital bed. "I brought you something even better," Sarah replied with exaggerated mystery. She revealed a small container of vanilla pudding with a tiny plastic spoon shaped like a dinosaur. "The kitchen manager said this spoon has special healing powers." Tommy's eyes widened with the seriousness that only children could apply to such matters. "Really?" "Well," Sarah whispered conspiratorially, "I can't make any medical promises, but I've never seen anyone eat pudding with a dinosaur spoon who didn't feel at least a little bit better afterward." As Tommy carefully examined his dinosaur spoon, Sarah felt the familiar warmth that made her job worthwhile. In a place where people dealt with pain, uncertainty, and fear, these small moments of connection mattered more than most people realized. The cardiac unit was always quieter. Patients there were often restricted in their movements, connected to machines that monitored every heartbeat. Sarah had learned to move with extra care in these rooms, understanding that even the sound of wheels on linoleum could be startling to someone whose heart was already struggling. Mr. Rodriguez in room 402 had been admitted 2 weeks ago after a massive heart attack. He was only 45 years old, a construction worker with 3 young children. His wife, Maria, had been practically living at the hospital, sleeping in the uncomfortable bedside chair and surviving on vending machine snacks and whatever food friends brought from home. "Maria, you need to eat something substantial," Sarah said gently, setting down a tray that contained not just the patient meal, but an additional sandwich and fruit cup. "I know the cafeteria isn't exactly home cooking, but you can't take care of him if you don't take care of yourself." Maria looked up with tired eyes. "I keep thinking if I leave, something might happen. What if he needs me?" Sarah had heard this conversation countless times from countless family members. The fear of stepping away, even for basic needs, was one of the most common struggles for people with loved ones in critical care. "He needs you strong," Sarah replied, pulling up a chair to sit beside Maria for a moment. "I've seen a lot of families go through this. The ones who take care of themselves are able to be present for the long journey of recovery. This isn't a sprint, it's a marathon." As Sarah continued her rounds, she noticed the subtle changes that occurred throughout the hospital during different times of day. Morning brought a sense of renewed energy and hope. Afternoon carried the weight of fatigue and the reality of long days. Evening brought families together, creating small gatherings around hospital beds where normal life tried to assert itself despite the clinical surroundings. The oncology ward required a different kind of strength from Sarah. Here, patients and families faced uncertainty with courage that both inspired and humbled her. She had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing she could offer was simply showing up consistently, being a familiar face in a world that had become unpredictable. Mrs. Patterson in room 501 was undergoing chemotherapy for breast cancer. She was a retired school teacher who had spent 40 years helping children learn to read. Now, at 68, she was learning to navigate a new kind of challenge. Her husband brought fresh flowers every other day, and their adult children took turns visiting, but Sarah had noticed that Mrs. Patterson often seemed lonely during the long hours between visits. "How are you feeling today?" Sarah asked, arranging the lunch tray on the bedside table. "Some days are better than others," Mrs. Patterson replied honestly. "Today is somewhere in the middle." Sarah understood that this was actually good news. In cancer treatment, somewhere in the middle often meant functioning, managing, coping. It meant the medication was working without causing unbearable side effects. "I brought you some extra crackers," Sarah said. "Sometimes they help when your stomach feels uncertain." "You're very thoughtful," Mrs. Patterson said. "You know, in all my years of teaching, I learned that it's often the small kindnesses that students remember most." "I think that's true in hospitals too." As the afternoon progressed, Sarah began preparing for the dinner service. This was typically the busiest time of day, as families gathered for visiting hours and the hospital buzzed with activity. Doctors made final rounds, nurses completed shift changes, and patients who had been resting all day became more alert and social. The emergency department was always unpredictable. Sarah never knew what she might encounter when delivering meals to patients who had been admitted for observation or were waiting for test results. Some had been in car accidents, others had experienced sudden illnesses, and a few were dealing with mental health crises that had brought them to the hospital. In the emergency department's observation area, Sarah met David, a 23-year-old college student who had collapsed during basketball practice. Tests had revealed an irregular heartbeat that doctors were still trying to diagnose. David's parents had driven 5 hours to be with him, and their worry was evident in every gesture and expression. "I keep telling them I'm fine," David said as Sarah set down his dinner tray. "It was probably just dehydration or something." Sarah had learned that sometimes what patients said to their families and what they said to hospital staff were different things. Young people, especially, often tried to minimize their fears to protect their parents from additional worry. "Sometimes our bodies have ways of telling us to slow down," Sarah said carefully. "Good thing you have parents who love you enough to drive 5 hours to make sure you're okay." As evening approached, Sarah began her final rounds of the day. The hospital took on a different atmosphere after sunset. Hallways became quieter, rooms dimmer, and the pace of activity slowed to accommodate patients who needed rest. This was often when the most profound conversations happened, when people felt safe enough to express their deepest fears and hopes. In the intensive care unit, Sarah delivered a meal to the family of a patient who had been in a coma for 6 days following a motorcycle accident. The young man's girlfriend, Rachel, had barely left his side. She had been talking to him constantly, reading him books, playing his favorite music, and holding his hand while machines kept his body functioning. The doctors say hearing is the last sense to go and the first to return, Rachel told Sarah as she mechanically stirred the soup on her tray. I keep talking to him, telling him about our plans, about the trip we were going to take to Colorado this summer. Sarah had witnessed many vigils like this one. Some ended with miraculous recoveries, others with peaceful farewells. All of them taught her something about the strength of human love and the power of hope in the face of uncertainty. As she prepared to end her shift, Sarah reflected on the day's interactions. Each patient, each family member, each small conversation had contributed to the complex tapestry of life that existed within the hospital walls. Tomorrow would bring new faces, new stories, and new opportunities to provide comfort through simple acts of service. She cleaned her cart thoroughly, restocked supplies for the night shift, and completed her paperwork with the same attention to detail she brought to every aspect of her job. As she prepared to leave, Sarah had no way of knowing that tomorrow would be unlike any day she had ever experienced at St. Mary's Medical Center, and that her routine of carrying lunch trays through hospital corridors would intersect with events that would change everything forever. The morning of March 16th began with an unusual energy in the hospital. Sarah noticed it the moment she walked through the employee entrance. There was something different in the way staff members moved through the hallways, a subtle tension that she couldn't quite identify. Conversations seemed more urgent, and several security guards were posted in areas where she had never seen them before. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked Miguel as she began preparing the breakfast carts. Miguel looked around before answering, lowering his voice slightly. "There was some kind of incident downtown last night. Police have been asking hospitals to increase security protocols. Probably nothing to worry about, but they want us to be extra careful about visitors and packages." Sarah had lived in the city long enough to know that incidents downtown could mean anything from a robbery to something more serious. The hospital had emergency protocols for various situations, but in her 3 years of employment, she had never seen them activated beyond the occasional severe weather warning. As she loaded the first cart of the day, Sarah noticed that several patients had been moved during the night. Room assignments had changed, and she needed to double-check her delivery list to ensure meals went to the right people. Mrs. Chen, whom she had been monitoring closely, had been transferred to a different wing. Tommy, the 8-year-old with the dinosaur spoon, was no longer in pediatrics. Where did they move the patients from the East Wing? Sarah asked Nancy, the head nurse on duty. "Maintenance issues," Nancy replied quickly, but her expression suggested there was more to the story. "Some kind of electrical problem they need to fix. Everyone's been moved temporarily to other floors." Sarah accepted this explanation, though she found it curious that electrical work would require moving patients in the middle of the night. Usually, such maintenance was scheduled well in advance, and families were notified days ahead of time. But hospitals operated on schedules and priorities that often seemed mysterious to support staff like herself. The first delivery stop was the cardiac unit, where Mr. Rodriguez was now in a room 2 doors down from his previous location. Maria was still beside his bed, looking even more exhausted than before. The stress of the sudden room change had clearly added to her already overwhelming anxiety. "They moved him in the middle of the night," Maria told Sarah, her voice shaking slightly. "Said it was routine, but nothing about this feels routine. What if something's wrong? What if his condition got worse and they're not telling me?" Sarah set down the breakfast tray and sat beside Maria, recognizing the need for reassurance. "Hospital moves happen more often than you might think. Sometimes it's about balancing the workload between different nursing stations. Sometimes it's about grouping patients with similar needs together. What matters is that he's getting the same quality care, just in a different room." But, as Sarah continued her rounds, she began to notice other unusual details.
There were more staff members than usual in the hallways, many of whom she didn't recognize.
Some wore the standard hospital uniforms, but others dressed in business attire with badges that weren't familiar to her. They moved with purpose, checking rooms, speaking quietly into phones, and carrying equipment she had never seen before. In the pediatric wing, which was now temporarily housed on the third floor, Tommy was in good spirits despite the confusion of waking up in an unfamiliar room. His parents had stayed the night and looked bewildered by the sudden changes in their son's care environment. "The nice lady last night said they needed to move everyone for safety," Tommy's mother explained to Sarah. But she wouldn't really explain what that meant.
"Tommy's been asking questions all morning, and I don't know how to answer them."
Sarah looked at Tommy, who was arranging his dinosaur spoon collection on the bedside table. Children were remarkably adaptable, but they also picked up on adult anxiety in ways that parents sometimes underestimated.
"You know what, Tommy?" Sarah said, kneeling beside his bed.
"Sometimes hospitals are like big puzzles, and the grown-ups need to rearrange the pieces to make everything work better. You're still getting the same great care, just in a different colored room."
"Are we safe?" Tommy asked directly, with the kind of straightforward honesty that only children possessed. Sarah paused, realizing that this was a question she couldn't answer definitively.
"The doctors and nurses and security people are all working together to make sure everyone in the hospital is as safe as possible. That's their job, and they're very good at it." As she moved through the hospital, Sarah began to piece together fragments of conversations and observations that suggested something more significant than electrical maintenance had prompted the overnight changes. She overheard a doctor mentioning elevated threat levels to a colleague. A security guard was discussing perimeter checks with someone on his radio. The hospital's public address system had made several announcements about updated visitor protocols, requiring all guests to register at the main information desk and receive temporary identification badges. The oncology ward had been relocated to a section of the hospital that Sarah rarely visited. Mrs. Patterson seemed confused by the change but was handling it with the grace she brought to most challenges in her life. 40 years of teaching prepared me for unexpected changes," she told Sarah with a weak smile. "You learn to roll with whatever the day brings.
Though I must admit, this feels more dramatic than a surprise fire drill." "How are you feeling today?" Sarah asked, noting that Mrs. Patterson looked paler than usual.
"Tired," Mrs. Patterson admitted. "The move disrupted my sleep, and I had treatment yesterday. But I'm grateful to be here, to have access to care. There are people in the world who don't have what I have." Sarah was struck, as she often was, by the perspective that serious illness could bring to people. Mrs. Patterson had every reason to complain about the inconvenience and confusion, but instead, she chose to focus on gratitude. It was a lesson Sarah tried to carry with her through each day. During her lunch break, Sarah decided to call her younger sister, Elena, who worked as a reporter for the local newspaper. If something significant was happening in the city, Elena would likely know about it. "Sarah, I'm glad you called," Elena said, her voice carrying an urgency that immediately put Sarah on alert. "There's been chatter about some kind of security concern affecting several buildings downtown. I can't get specific details yet, but the police have been very tight-lipped. Are you seeing anything unusual at the hospital?" Sarah looked around the break room, where several co-workers were eating lunch and discussing the morning's changes in hushed tones. "They moved a lot of patients overnight. Officially, it's for electrical maintenance, but everyone seems on edge." "Be careful," Elena said seriously. "I don't want to alarm you, but my contacts in law enforcement are taking whatever this is very seriously. If anything feels wrong, don't hesitate to leave work early." After ending the call, Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach. She had always felt safe at St. Mary's Medical Center. It was a place of healing, a sanctuary for people dealing with illness and injury. The idea that external threats might penetrate that sanctuary was deeply unsettling. The afternoon rounds revealed more subtle signs of the enhanced security measures. Sarah noticed that certain elevators were restricted to staff use only. Some hallways had been cordoned off for maintenance, but she could see security personnel positioned at the barriers. The parking garage had additional guards checking identification and inspecting bags. In the intensive care unit, Rachel was still maintaining her vigil beside her boyfriend's bed. The young man, whose name Sarah had learned was Marcus, showed slight improvements in his brain activity, according to the latest test results. Rachel's hope was palpable, but she was also exhausted from days of emotional strain. "I keep thinking about all the things we never said to each other," Rachel confided to Sarah as she picked at her dinner.
"You always think you have more time to say the important things. Now I'm trying to say them all at once, hoping he can hear me." Sarah had observed many people working through similar regrets and realizations. Hospital settings had a way of clarifying priorities and highlighting what truly mattered in life. "Sometimes the things we don't say out loud are still communicated," Sarah offered gently. "Love doesn't always need words." As evening approached, Sarah noticed that the hospital's atmosphere had become increasingly tense. More security personnel were visible, and several police officers were stationed at key entrances. The public address system announced that visiting hours would be shortened and that all visitors would need to undergo additional screening procedures. Dr. Williams approached Sarah during the dinner service, looking more serious than usual. "Sarah, I want to thank you for the extra attention you've been giving to patients and families. I know today has been unusual and probably confusing. The staff really appreciates how you've helped maintain a sense of normalcy for everyone." "Is everything going to be okay?" Sarah asked directly.
Dr. Williams paused, choosing her words carefully.
"We're taking precautions based on information from law enforcement. The safety of patients, families, and staff is always our top priority.
Right now, that means being extra careful and following security protocols that might seem inconvenient but are necessary." As Sarah completed her final rounds of the day, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was building toward a climax. The tension in the hospital had been steadily increasing throughout the day, and, despite the efforts of staff to maintain routine, an undercurrent of anxiety was affecting everyone. In the emergency department, she encountered a new patient who had been brought in after collapsing at his workplace downtown. The man, who appeared to be in his 40s, was conscious but seemed disoriented and frightened. His symptoms didn't appear to match any obvious medical condition, and the doctors were running extensive tests to determine what had caused his sudden illness. "He keeps asking about a smell at his office building," one of the nurses mentioned to her colleague. "Says it was chemical-like, but building management claims they haven't used any cleaning products or done any renovation work recently." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. A chemical smell that caused someone to collapse could be many things, but given the heightened security measures and the mysterious incidents downtown that Miguel had mentioned, it seemed potentially connected to whatever was causing the increased concern among law enforcement. As she cleaned her card and prepared to end her shift, Sarah made a decision to stay a little longer than usual. Something about the day's events made her reluctant to leave the patients and families who had become like an extended community to her. If there was truly some kind of threat affecting the city, she wanted to be available to help in whatever way she could. The night shift staff was arriving with briefing materials and additional security protocols. Sarah overheard fragments of conversations about contamination procedures and emergency evacuation plans. The pieces of information were starting to form a picture that frightened her, but she tried to focus on what she could control: being present, being helpful, and being ready to serve others in whatever capacity might be needed. As she walked through the hospital corridors one final time before officially ending her shift, Sarah carried with her the faces and stories of all the people she had served that day. Mrs. Patterson's grateful perspective, Tommy's resilient spirit, Maria's devoted love for her husband, Rachel's hope for Marcus's recovery. These human connections felt more precious than ever in the face of unknown threats and uncertain times. Tomorrow, she decided, she would arrive early and stay late if necessary. Whatever was happening in their city, whatever challenges lay ahead, the patients and families at St. Mary's Medical Center would not face them alone. Sarah Martinez, who had started as someone who simply carried lunch trays through hospital corridors, had become someone who carried hope, comfort, and human connection to people in their most vulnerable moments. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow would test every aspect of her commitment to that mission, and that the skills she had developed in reading people, staying calm under pressure, and providing comfort in crisis would become more important than she could possibly imagine. March 17 arrived with a gray sky that seemed to reflect the somber mood that had settled over St. Mary's Medical Center. Sarah arrived at work to find the employee parking lot surrounded by concrete barriers that had been installed overnight. Security guards were checking identification at every entrance, and all bags were being inspected before anyone could enter the building.
"What's happening?" Sarah asked one of the security guards as he examined her employee badge with unusual scrutiny.
"Enhanced safety protocols," the guard replied without making eye contact. "Please proceed directly to your work area and report any unusual activity to security immediately." The kitchen area bustled with nervous energy. Miguel was coordinating with supervisor Sarah had never seen before, and the usual breakfast preparation routine had been modified to include additional safety checks. All food deliveries were being screened, and several items that normally came from outside vendors had been replaced with alternatives from approved suppliers. "They're testing everything," Miguel explained quietly to Sarah as she began loading her cart.
"Food, water, air quality, everything.
Nobody's saying exactly what they're looking for, but it's clear they're taking no chances." Sarah noticed that her delivery list had been modified again. Several patients had been moved to different floors, and some rooms were marked as restricted access. The hospital was beginning to feel less like a place of healing and more like a fortress preparing for an uncertain threat. Her first stop was the cardiac unit, where Mr. Rodriguez had been moved to a room with reinforced windows and additional monitoring equipment. Maria looked exhausted beyond words, her eyes red from crying and lack of sleep. "They won't tell me what's going on," Maria whispered to Sarah, glancing around to make sure they couldn't be overheard. "But they keep asking about his symptoms, whether anything has changed, whether he's experienced any new reactions. They've run more tests in the past 2 days than in the entire previous week." Sarah set down the breakfast tray and noticed that it contained different items than usual. Instead of the typical hospital breakfast, there were sealed packages from certified suppliers, water bottles with tamper-proof caps, and pre-packaged foods that looked more like military rations than patient meals. "I'm sure they're just being extra careful," Sarah said, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed her own words.
"Sometimes hospitals update their procedures to meet new safety standards."
As she continued her rounds, Sarah began to piece together a clearer picture of what was happening. The man who had been brought to the emergency room the previous day with respiratory symptoms had been joined by 3 others with similar complaints. All of them had worked in buildings within a 6-block radius downtown. All of them reported detecting unusual chemical odors before becoming ill.
The pediatric unit, now housed on the 4th floor, had implemented additional protocols for children and their families.
Parents were being asked detailed questions about recent travel, exposure to chemicals, and any unusual symptoms their children might have experienced. Tommy was scheduled for additional blood tests, despite the fact that his appendix surgery had been completely successful.
"Why do they need more blood?"
Tommy's mother asked Sarah, her voice tight with worry.
"He's recovered from the surgery. What could they be looking for?"
Sarah didn't have an answer, but she could see the fear growing in the eyes of parents throughout the wing. Children, with their remarkable adaptability, were handling the changes better than the adults. But even they could sense the increased tension and anxiety surrounding them. "Maybe they're just making sure everyone is as healthy as possible," Sarah suggested, kneeling down to Tommy's eye level. "Sometimes doctors like to double-check things to be absolutely certain."
"Are the bad germs coming?" Tommy asked with the directness that always caught adults off guard. Sarah paused, realizing that simple honesty might be more comforting than false reassurance.
"The doctors and nurses are working very hard to keep all the good germs strong and all the bad germs away.
That's why there are so many people here helping to keep everyone safe."
In the oncology ward, Mrs. Patterson had been moved to a room that overlooked the parking lot. From her window, she could see the constant activity of security personnel, police vehicles, and official-looking cars coming and going throughout the day. "It reminds me of the newsreels from my childhood," Mrs. Patterson told Sarah as she slowly ate her breakfast. "During the Cold War, when everyone was worried about things they couldn't see or understand. My parents tried to shield us children from the fear, but we could feel it in everything the adults did.
Mrs.
Patterson's perspective, shaped by decades of life experience, helped Sarah understand that what they were experiencing was part of a larger pattern of how communities responded to perceived threats.
But, knowing that didn't make the current situation any less frightening or uncertain. How are you feeling about your treatment? Sarah asked, noticing that Mrs. Patterson's medical chart had been updated with additional notes and monitoring requirements.
The doctors seem more interested in my blood work than usual, Mrs. Patterson replied thoughtfully.
They've added tests I've never had before.
When I asked about it, they said it was part of a comprehensive health assessment.
I've learned that when doctors use vague language like that, it usually means they're looking for something specific but don't want to worry you unnecessarily.
As the morning progressed, Sarah observed that the hospital was operating under what appeared to be emergency protocols, even though no official emergency had been declared.
Staff members wore identification badges that were checked multiple times throughout their shifts.
All communication was being monitored, and personal cell phone use was restricted in certain areas of the building. During her lunch break, Sarah tried calling her sister Elena again, but the call went straight to voicemail.
When she tried the newspaper's main number, she was told that Elena was on assignment and unavailable.
This was unusual, as Elena typically returned calls quickly, especially from family members. Instead, Sarah decided to call her mother, who lived across town and might have information about what was happening in the broader community.
"Mija, I'm so glad to hear from you," her mother said, relief evident in her voice.
"There are rumors all over the neighborhood about some kind of chemical leak or terrorist threat downtown.
The news isn't reporting much, but people are talking. Are you safe at the hospital?"
"I think so," Sarah replied, though she wasn't entirely certain. "They've increased security and changed a lot of procedures, but no one is explaining exactly why. I'm supposed to finish my shift in a few hours. Maybe you should come home early today," her mother suggested. "I don't like the idea of you being in a big building if something dangerous is happening." After ending the call, Sarah felt torn between her responsibility to the patients who depended on her daily care and her growing concern for her own safety. The hospital had become a second home to her, and the people she served had become like family. The idea of abandoning them during a time of uncertainty felt wrong, but she also understood her mother's concern. The afternoon rounds revealed that the situation was escalating rather than improving. Several more patients had arrived with symptoms similar to those of the downtown workers. The emergency department had been reconfigured to create isolated treatment areas, and staff members were wearing protective equipment that Sarah had never seen before. In the intensive care unit, Marcus had shown slight improvement in his neurological responses, bringing tears of joy to Rachel's eyes. But even this good news was overshadowed by the increasing tension throughout the hospital.
"They keep asking me about whether Marcus was downtown on the day of his accident," Rachel told Sarah.
"I don't understand what that has to do with his recovery. He was at basketball practice on campus, nowhere near downtown."
Sarah realized that the medical staff was trying to determine whether any of their patients might have been exposed to whatever was causing the illness in the downtown workers.
The fact that they were asking about patients who had been admitted for completely unrelated reasons suggested that the potential threat was being taken very seriously.
As evening approached, Sarah noticed that the hospital was implementing what appeared to be lockdown procedures.
Visiting hours were suspended entirely, and family members who were already in the hospital were being asked to remain overnight rather than leave and return the next day. Security guards were posted at every exit, and no one was allowed to enter or leave without specific authorization. Dr. Williams found Sarah during the dinner service, looking more stressed than she had ever seen her.
"Sarah, I need you to know that we may be implementing emergency protocols sometime tonight," Dr. Williams said quietly. "If that happens, all non-essential personnel will be asked to shelter in place until further notice.
You're not required to stay, but if you choose to leave, you may not be able to return until the situation is resolved."
"What kind of situation are we dealing with?" Sarah asked directly.
Dr. Williams glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "There's been a potential exposure to an unknown chemical agent in several buildings downtown. We don't know if it was accidental or intentional, and we don't know if there might be additional exposures. The hospital is being treated as a potential target because we're treating the affected patients.
The weight of this information settled over Sarah like a heavy blanket. The random illnesses, the security measures, the patient relocations, everything suddenly made sense.
St. Mary's Medical Center wasn't just treating victims of a chemical exposure, it might itself become a target for whatever force was responsible for the initial incident.
How many people know about this? Sarah asked.
Essential staff only, and now you, Dr. Williams replied.
We're trying to maintain normal operations while preparing for worst-case scenarios.
The patients and families don't need the additional stress of knowing about potential threats unless it becomes absolutely necessary. As Sarah completed her evening rounds, she carried this knowledge with her like a secret burden. Every smile she gave to patients, every word of comfort she offered to worried families, was now informed by the understanding that they might all be in danger. Yet somehow, this knowledge made her interactions feel more precious rather than more frightening. Mrs. Patterson seemed to sense that something significant was happening, even without being told the specifics. You have the look of someone carrying heavy news, she observed as Sarah arranged her dinner tray. Just a long day, Sarah replied, not wanting to add to Mrs. Patterson's already considerable challenges. I've learned to read faces during my years of teaching, Mrs. Patterson said gently.
And, in my weeks of cancer treatment, I've become even better at it. Whatever is happening, I want you to know that your presence here, your kindness, makes a difference.
Sometimes the simplest acts of service become the most important things in the world. As Sarah prepared to make her decision about whether to stay or leave, she thought about all the people who had touched her life during her 3 years at St. Mary's Medical Center. Tommy with his dinosaur spoon collection, Maria's devoted love for her husband, Rachel's vigil for Marcus, Mrs. Patterson's graceful courage in facing cancer. These weren't just patients to her anymore, they were human beings whose lives had become intertwined with her own. The hospital's public address system crackled to life with an announcement that would change everything. Attention all personnel and visitors.
St. Mary's Medical Center is now implementing Code Yellow protocols. Please remain calm and follow all instructions from security and medical staff.
Sarah had never heard of Code Yellow, but, from the immediate increase in activity around her, she understood that this was the beginning of whatever emergency Dr. Williams had warned her about. As she stood in the hallway holding an empty lunch tray, Sarah realized that her decision about staying or leaving was about to be made for her. The outside world was about to intrude into the sanctuary of healing that she had served for 3 years, and nothing would ever be the same again.
The Code Yellow announcement transformed St. Mary's Medical Center into a place Sarah barely recognized.
Within minutes, security personnel were directing all non-essential staff to designated safe areas while medical teams prepared for what appeared to be an imminent emergency. Sarah found herself caught between following evacuation protocols and her instinct to continue serving the patients who had come to depend on her daily presence. "Sarah, you need to report to the main conference room immediately," called Nancy, the head nurse, as she hurried past with an armload of medical supplies.
All food service personnel are being relocated.
But, as Sarah began walking toward the conference room, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold.
It was a soft, electronic beeping coming from somewhere near the elevator bank.
The sound was rhythmic and insistent, like a timer counting down to something. She had worked in the hospital long enough to recognize various alarms and warning signals, but this was something new and ominous. The beeping seemed to be coming from a maintenance cart that had been left unattended near the main elevator. Sarah approached cautiously, noting that the cart contained supplies she didn't recognize, containers with labels she couldn't read, equipment that didn't match anything she had seen in her 3 years at the hospital. As she got closer, the beeping became more rapid and urgent. A small digital display on one of the containers showed numbers counting down, 447, 446, 445. Sarah's heart began racing as she realized what she might be looking at. This wasn't hospital equipment. This was something that didn't belong here, something dangerous that had been brought into the place where she had always felt safe.
"Security!"
Sarah shouted down the hallway, her voice echoing off the walls.
"Security! There's something here that doesn't belong."
2 security guards came running, followed quickly by Dr. Williams and several other medical staff members. As they approached the maintenance cart, the beeping became even more frantic, and the countdown display showed 3:12, 311, 310.
Everyone back, shouted one of the security guards, immediately recognizing the threat. Evacuate this floor now. The next few minutes became a blur of organized chaos.
Alarms began sounding throughout the hospital as staff implemented emergency evacuation procedures they had practiced but never hoped to use. Patients who could walk were helped to stairwells, while those who needed wheelchairs or gurneys were quickly moved by teams of nurses and orderlies. Sarah found herself helping to evacuate Mrs. Patterson, whose chemotherapy treatments had left her weak and unsteady on her feet. As they slowly made their way down the emergency stairwell, Mrs. Patterson maintained the grace and composure that had impressed Sarah from their first meeting. "I suppose this is more excitement than I expected during my treatment," Mrs. Patterson said with a weak smile as they descended step by step. "But I'm grateful you're here to help me through it." The stairwells filled with a steady stream of people moving as quickly as safely possible toward the emergency exits. Sarah could see Tommy being carried by his father, his mother close behind with tears streaming down her face. Maria was helping transport her husband on a gurney, refusing to leave his side even as medical staff assured her that he would be taken care of. In the intensive care unit, the evacuation process was more complex. Patients connected to life support equipment required careful coordination to ensure they remained stable during the move. Sarah watched as Rachel helped the medical team transport Marcus, maintaining her vigil even as they navigated the challenging logistics of moving a comatose patient down multiple flights of stairs.
2 minutes, announced a voice over the hospital's emergency communication system. All personnel and patients must be clear of the main building in 2 minutes. The countdown that Sarah had discovered was apparently synchronizing with whatever device had been hidden in the maintenance cart. As they reached the ground floor and exited into the parking lot, Sarah could see that the entire hospital was being evacuated. Hundreds of patients, family members, and staff were gathering in designated areas while emergency vehicles surrounded the building. The night sky was illuminated by flashing lights from fire trucks, ambulances, police cars, and vehicles from agencies Sarah didn't recognize. Personnel in hazmat suits were establishing a perimeter around the hospital, while others set up temporary medical stations to continue treating patients who couldn't be transported to other facilities. 30 seconds, the announcement continued. All personnel take cover. Sarah found herself crouched behind an ambulance with Mrs. Patterson, both of them watching the building where they had spent so much time together. The hospital had been more than just a workplace for Sarah, it had been a community where she had found purpose and meaning in serving others during their most vulnerable moments. The explosion, when it came, was both smaller and more devastating than Sarah had expected. Rather than a massive blast that destroyed the building, it was a controlled release of something invisible but deadly. Emergency personnel immediately began shouting warnings about chemical contamination, and the perimeter around the hospital was expanded. "Chemical dispersal confirmed," announced emergency coordinators through loudspeakers. "All personnel maintain safe distance. Decontamination procedures are now in effect." The reality of what had almost happened began to sink in. If Sarah hadn't noticed the suspicious maintenance cart, if she hadn't heard the beeping and called for help, hundreds of patients and staff members could have been exposed to whatever chemical agent had been deployed. The evacuation that had felt chaotic and frightening had actually been a precisely coordinated effort that had saved countless lives. As emergency teams began the process of decontaminating the hospital, temporary medical facilities were established in the parking lot and nearby buildings. The patients who had been evacuated needed continued care, and the medical staff worked to recreate their treatment protocols in makeshift conditions. Sarah found herself once again serving meals to patients, this time from a mobile kitchen unit that had been brought in by emergency services. The faces were the same people she had been caring for inside the hospital, but now they were dealing with the additional trauma of having their safe healing environment violated by an act of terrorism. "You saved us," Tommy told Sarah as she brought him a sandwich in the temporary pediatric area that had been set up in a nearby church. "My mom said you found the bad thing before it could hurt people." Sarah knelt down beside Tommy, who was still clutching his dinosaur spoon despite everything that had happened. "Sometimes we all have to help take care of each other," she replied. "That's what makes us strong." Mr. Rodriguez had been transported to another hospital for continued cardiac care,
but Maria had stayed behind to thank Sarah personally for her role in the evacuation. "I don't know how to repay someone who helped save my husband's life," Maria said, tears in her eyes. "You don't need to repay anything," Sarah replied. "We're all part of the same community. We take care of each other." Over the following days, as the investigation into the attack continued and the hospital underwent extensive decontamination, Sarah learned that the chemical agent had been designed to be odorless and invisible, making it nearly impossible to detect until symptoms began appearing. The device that had been hidden in the maintenance cart would have dispersed the agent throughout the hospital's ventilation system, potentially affecting everyone in the building. The suspected perpetrator was someone who had lost a family member in the hospital several months earlier and had blamed the medical staff for the death. The grief and anger had evolved into a desire for revenge that nearly resulted in mass casualties. It was a reminder that even places dedicated to healing could become targets for those whose pain had transformed into something destructive. Mrs. Patterson was transferred to another medical center for the remainder of her chemotherapy treatments, but she made sure to stay in contact with Sarah. "You taught me something important," she told Sarah during their final conversation. "Sometimes the most ordinary jobs are actually the most extraordinary opportunities to serve others." Marcus eventually woke up from his coma and made a full recovery. Rachel credited Sarah with helping her maintain hope during the darkest days of his treatment. The young couple decided to get married in the hospital chapel once it was reopened and decontaminated, with Sarah as one of their honored guests. Tommy recovered completely from his surgery and returned to school with stories about his adventure at the hospital. He kept his dinosaur spoon collection as a reminder of the kind food service lady who had made him laugh and helped keep him safe. St. Mary's Medical Center reopened 6 weeks later with enhanced security protocols and a renewed commitment to providing a safe environment for healing. Sarah returned to her job carrying lunch trays through the corridors, but now she carried something additional: the knowledge that even the smallest acts of attention and service could have profound consequences. The maintenance cart incident became a case study in hospital security and the importance of staff awareness. Sarah was recognized not just as someone who had prevented a potential disaster, but as an example of how every employee, regardless of their official job description, played a vital role in protecting the people they served. On quiet days, when she walked through the hospital corridors with her cart of lunch trays, Sarah sometimes thought about how different things might have been if she had followed evacuation procedures instead of investigating the strange beeping sound. But she had learned something important about herself during those terrifying minutes. When faced with potential danger to the people she cared about, her instinct was to move toward the threat rather than away from it. The patients, families, and colleagues at St. Mary's Medical Center had become more than just the people she served in her daily work. They had become a community united by shared vulnerability and mutual care. The attack had been intended to destroy that community, but, instead, it had strengthened the bonds between everyone who had experienced the crisis together. Sarah's role as someone who carried lunch trays through hospital corridors had evolved into something much more significant. She had become a guardian of the healing environment, someone who paid attention to details that others might miss, someone who understood that keeping people safe was as important as keeping them fed. Years later, when people asked Sarah about the day she heard the beeping in the hospital corridor, she would tell them that it wasn't really about her quick thinking or her courage in the face of danger. It was about the fact that she had learned to see the patients and families at St. Mary's Medical Center as people worth protecting, people whose stories mattered, people whose lives were precious enough to risk her own safety. The simple act of carrying lunch trays through hospital corridors had taught Sarah that service to others was not just about completing tasks or following procedures. It was about creating a community where people could heal not just from their medical conditions, but from the fears and uncertainties that came with being vulnerable in an unpredictable world. In the end, the beeping that had warned of impending danger had also revealed something beautiful about human nature, that ordinary people doing ordinary jobs could become extraordinary protectors of the communities they served, and that the smallest acts of attention and care could literally mean the difference between life and death for the people around them.